Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm delighted to be here and just want to thank the Art Institute for the opportunity to talk to you about this subject, one that has been interesting me greatly over the past few years. In 1927, the year Benton posed for this photograph, the renowned architectural historian and cultural critic Lewis Mumford declared that Benton's paintings, quote, are a genuine contribution to Americana, end quote. He continued, quote, and I trust that people who now absurdly overvalue a Currier and Ives print will not overlook a mature form of it today. This is the firm's 1884 lithograph, A Cotton Plantation on the Mississippi. The following year, in another review, Mumford again invoked Currier and Ives in his appraisal of Benton's art. Quote, what Currier and Ives' prints did in their matter-of-fact naivete, Mr. Benton, with a slight satirical twist, accomplishes with more deliberate effort on a higher plane. One can appreciate the rhetorical force of his argument in a comparison of the print with a 1925 panel from Benton's American historical epic, Slaves, in the Terrace collection. Benton's American Historical Epic mural series, begun in 1919, was the specific subject of Mumford's 1927 reviews. Mumford deliberately allied Benton's painting to Americana, art and artifacts relating to the history, geography, folklore, and cultural heritage of America. In claiming Benton's paintings as a genuine contribution to Americana, Mumford tried to elevate Americana to the level of high art, traditionally understood as painting, sculpture, or mural decoration. Mumford challenged the distinctions between popular collectibles and grand art historical traditions like history painting. By appealing to what he deemed, quote, their respect for the native art of 50 years ago, end quote, Mumford intended to champion Benton's interpretation and expression of American subject matter as a bold new manifestation of both American art and Americana. Benton's epic appeared to support Mumford's call to think more broadly and natively about what constituted the most important and genuine artistic expressions of America. The epic was Benton's earliest large-scale public mural project, one embarked on without a commission or a building, an unconventional people's history of the United States. Conversely, Benton's own family history represented conventional narratives recounting official American history. Born in 1889, Benton was the son of a U.S. congressman and the namesake of his great-uncle, Senator Thomas Hart Benton, Missouri's first senator from 1821 to 1851. Senator Benton famously championed Indian removal and westward expansion, yet vehemently opposed the spread of slavery. The senator's son-in-law was John Fremont, a great explorer of the American West who was called the Pathfinder. And Benton named this panel after him. Seeking to make a similar name for himself in American art and to grapple with these historical legacies, Benton tried to reinvent history painting and mural decoration for modern America through a visual investigation of the nation's historical race relations. Unlike the matter-of-fact naivete of these Currier and Ives prints idealizing Calistoga wagons forging westward, yet another battle against the Indians won, or bucolic plantation life, Benton's murals unflinchingly expressed a contested notion of the American people through scenes of violence and exploitation historically wrought by whites upon American Indians and African Americans. Benton was unable to sell any of the panels or secure a commission to continue with the project. Ultimately, Benton abandoned his epic in 1928 after nearly a decade of work on the project. But Benton did not abandon his pursuit of American art forms that accounted for racial experience in the United States. A consideration of the epic is therefore an important precursor to any discussion of his work. Benton's paintings and drawings of cotton picking and cotton pickers, made from around 1927 through 1945, sustained his key interests. From the early 19th century through well into the 20th, cotton picking was a defining agricultural activity of a racially structured American society and the principal cash crop of the South. King Cotton was the name bestowed on this reigning agricultural, economic, and social system rooted in the South, presented here in a 1907 souvenir postcard. Its kingdom encompassed the histories and experiences of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and sharecropping and tenant farming in the Jim Crow South across the Cotton Belt. The traditional Cotton Belt included nearly all of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, most of Arkansas and Louisiana, as well as southern Oklahoma and central Texas. Large areas of south-central North Carolina, western Tennessee, and southeastern Missouri also fell within its boundaries, defined by climate. Cotton requires a long, hot growing season. African American farmers and cotton pickers, first as slaves, then as tenants and sharecroppers, overwhelmingly provided the enormous labor force essential for harvesting cotton by hand. The Art Institute's Cotton Pickers, painted in 1945, is Benton's last major painting of the subject. In creating images of cotton pickers throughout his career, Benton knew that the white majority in the country represented his audience. Toni Morrison has written that American means white, but she demonstrates that such conceptions of Americanness and whiteness are unthinkable in the United States without the structuring presence of African Americans. Benton understood this in his time. In his art, he interpreted the historical relationships between blacks and whites in American society, their roles on the American land and in American history, and the Americanness of their lives and experiences. Benton was the first prominent modern American artist to tackle the subject of cotton picking since the 19th century. If thinking of a genealogy in American painting for Benton's cotton picking imagery, one could point to the quaint, stereotypical art by William Aiken Walker, or the nationally introspective character of a work like Winslow Homer's Cotton Pickers in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art collection. Painted in 1876, Homer's Cotton Pickers is based, as Benton's drawings and paintings later would be, on first-hand observations. Around 1874, Homer returned to the area around Petersburg, Virginia, where he had served as a Civil War correspondent, to explore scenes of daily life during Reconstruction. Cotton Pickers powerfully conveyed a sense of ambivalence and uncertainty about the state of the nation in its centennial year. Homer expressed the enormity of slavery's legacy through the vast cotton fields to be picked that extend around these former slaves. The apron of the figure on the right is symbolically caught on a cotton branch. He conveyed a reverence for their fortitude and sacrifices by elevating the two beautiful and strong female subjects above the cotton fields in a monumental and heroic manner. Benton's treatment of a woman offering water to a kneeling cotton picker is similarly elegiac. Homer's painting and Benton's canvas, completed almost 70 years later, are masterpieces of American art. But they can't be canonically isolated or conceptually disassociated from the range of popular imagery about cotton picking that inculcated the visual culture of ordinary Americans. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cotton picking emerged as a proud symbol tainted by racism of Southern life and traditions. These accepted and normalized fantasies of white superiority and romanticized the position of black field workers as a highly picturesque component not only of daily life in the South, but also as a physical and natural part of the Southern landscape, always in the background in the fields. Imagery expressing these customs and stereotypes appeared everywhere. Today, eBay troublingly characterizes the countless examples I locate on the site as so-called Black Americana. The imagery appeared incessantly from the mid-19th century until around World War II, in prints, stereographs, sheet music, highway, railroad, and bus maps, such as this 1937 Greyhound map, and you can see the racist imagery here and the cotton plants here. Coloring books, color postcards, and beginning in the early silent era, the movies. There was D.W. Griffith's controversial 1915 silent epic Birth of a Nation, with cotton-picking scenes appearing in the first 15 minutes of the film. In 1929, King Vidor's talkie Hallelujah premiered, opening with Stephen Foster's famous 1851 song, Old Folks at Home, accompanying images of cotton pickers in the field. Cotton picking inevitably signified insidiously timeless expressions of the Old South, of the world of plantations and slavery before the Confederacy's defeat, an attitude epitomized by this souvenir folder of the sunny South, the land of King Cotton, issued between 1920 and 29. It was a symbol of agricultural bounty and state pride promoted on picture postcards like this one from Moultrie, Georgia, available between 1930 and 1950. But it was also the object of governmental investigation, as demonstrated by this 1924 report on conditions facing child cotton pickers issued by the U.S. Department of Labor. The withering of King cotton due to overproduction, soil depletion and erosion, and related price collapses in 1920 and again in 1930 led to extreme rural poverty, situations exacerbated during the Depression. The deplorable conditions and the roots of their problems became the objects of federal intervention beginning in 1934 with the Resettlement Administration, later called the Farm Security Administration, or FSA. Leading American photographers hired by the FSA took their cameras to the South to document the state of affairs between 1935 and 1941. The renowned FSA photography program included photographs of workers by Ben Shawn, Marion Post Walcott, Russell Lee, Arthur Rothstein, and Jack Delano, among others, all of whom focused their lenses on King Cotton. In his widely seen government-funded documentary from 1937, The River, filmmaker Per Lorentz also showed extended footage of cotton picking, as well as cotton loading, a scene Benton painted in 1928 in Louisiana. Lorentz's energetic long shots and close-ups of black men loading cotton bales onto ships showed the insatiable international demand for the South's cotton that had led to the current environmental crises.
We made cotton king. We rolled 1 million bales down the river for Liverpool and Leeds. 1860, we rolled 4 million bales down the river. Rolled them off Alabama. Rolled them off Mississippi. Rolled them off Louisiana.
By 1945, when Benton stopped drawing and painting cotton picking, mechanical cotton picking started to become viable. Over the next quarter century, mechanized cotton harvesting slowly but surely displaced manual cotton picking until the laborious method was virtually non-existent in the United States by the early 1970s. This image of mechanical cotton pickers was postmarked in 1982. The caption on the back heralded, quote, "Greetings from Dixieland. The modern cotton pickers offer sharp contrast to the back-breaking job of hand-picking cotton." This 1986 picture of my brother and me was taken on our drive home to New Orleans from Alexandria, Louisiana, in the center of the state. The giant bins of harvested cotton were an irresistible roadside attraction totally disconnected from the human experience of picking cotton, which is basically forgotten today. The sense of historical and social distance felt from King Cotton and its cotton pickers is intensified in no small measure by the extensive efforts of the cotton industry during the last 50 years to remake and rebrand itself. In 1966, the year, this postcard circulated. Congress passed the Cotton Research and Promotion Act to conduct a, quote, wide-scale effort to recapture cotton's market share, end quote, an effort dependent upon fully mechanizing cotton production nationwide. In 1970, Cotton Incorporated, with world headquarters in North Carolina, was founded to, quote, combat loss of market share due to consumers' infatuation with synthetic fibers. As historian Gilbert Feet acknowledged in a 1950 study, quote, it has been argued that cotton growers using traditional hand methods are in no position to compete with a machine-manufactured product like rayon or nylon, end quote, or by the 1960s, polyester. The widespread embrace today of a comfortable, desirable fabric disconnected from how it was once hand-harvested predominantly by black cotton pickers began with the introduction of the Seal of Cotton in 1973. It continued with related ad campaigns. The most successful was the 1998 TV commercial that aired a new song, The Fabric of Our Lives. The melodious ballad extolling the touch, the feel, the fabric of our lives became an instant pop culture staple. Today, cotton is being marketed as a luxury item. The Sunday New York Times Magazine 10 days ago featured this Supima cotton spread. These major marketing campaigns have capitalized on the massive social, technological, and agricultural transitions that occurred to promote the value and prestige of American cotton. The contrast between cotton as a feel-good fabric in our minds today and cotton picking by hand as a vanished way of life in America is stark, even though this year, Hollywood brought back cotton picking into our imaginations in 12 Years a Slave, which won the Oscar for Best Picture. The aesthetic and compositional sophistication of director Steve McQueen's shots of slaves in the cotton fields are inescapably related to the paintings and photographs of cotton picking being discussed tonight. These examples are all worth mentioning because they represent our cultural context today and the apex of the cotton industry's 20th to 21st century trajectory. The art of Benton and his contemporaries, the popular visual culture of cotton picking, and the association of King Cotton with American identity plot some of its key coordinates. Beginning in the summer of 1924, Benton began traveling extensively around the United States. Missouri in 1924, the West and Southwest in 25 and 26, and the South in 27 and 28. He eschewed the cameras Farm Security Administration photographers took up in 1935. Nearly a decade before these artists turned their attention to what was happening in the South during the Great Depression, Benton was there and actively sought for pencil and for prose revelatory moments experienced on his journeys around the country. He selectively compiled these for his first autobiography, An Artist in America, published in 1937. He recounted, quote, I started going places and plowed around in the back countries where old manners persisted and old prejudices were sustained. I took them as they came. Benton proved a keen observer while he explored, as he described, quote, the back countries of America by foot, bus, and train, searching out American subject matter. In the chapter of his autobiography entitled The South, Benton vividly evoked the physical landscape of the cotton fields and scenes of cotton picking witnessed over the preceding decade. These are some of the drawings that illustrate that chapter. He also frankly commented about the region's race relations based on his experiences with Southerners. His passages about the cotton fields and pickers at work correspond to many of his paintings, but most directly with his first major canvas depicting the subject, Cotton Pickers, Georgia, painted in 1928 and acquired in 1933 by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it has just been put on view. Benton's descriptive writing is equally artful. Quote, the green of the cotton plant leaves was slightly bronzed about the edges. The stalks stuck out with dry, angular, jagged turns. The pods were full, bursting with white fluff. The ground under the September sun was a bright, gay, pink color. It was cut and crisscrossed with narrow purple shadows from the cotton plants and with big shadows thrown from the bodies of the pickers. The field stretched out a long ways. A few feet from where I stood, the pink ground was lost in a spotted canopy, iridescent in the heat of green, bronze, and fluffy white. Far away, beyond the field's end, a clump of dark, tall pine trees stood against the sky. Standing by the overseer, a kindly, pleasant Southerner, I was making drawings of the cotton pickers, men, women, and children who, bending over the white-mouthed cotton pods, dragged their long canvas bags on the ground as they went deftly from plant to plant. The bright gay pink color appears across the canvas ground, matched by the shirt of the woman picking cotton at the upper right. Everyone is busily going about the work. A quiet energy Benton conveys in elongated, wavering lines delineating lean figures with pointy limbs. At the symbolic center of the canvas is the Southerner, whose race, position, and scale within the composition express a quiet but overt influence over the lives of these cotton pickers. He appears contemplative, reflective, isolated. Seated on the ground with his arms around his knees and smoking a pipe, he exudes an objectionable languidness. Benton described him, quote, "He talked to me considerably about his workers, of the difficulty of keeping them properly furnished, and of seeing that their work was done thoroughly. Overseers are generally represented as hard-bitten, harsh, yelling slave drivers. This man was soft-voiced, spoke to his Negroes quietly and pleasantly. There was in him, however, something that the plantation blacks never trifled with. In spite of his mild ways, he was unmistakably boss. He saw to it that the cotton pods were picked clean and was well aware of the Negro problem of the South, and readily agreed that a sincere effort to educate the Negro was needed. He said it was impossible, however, to keep Negroes who could read and write in the cotton fields." End quote. Notice how Benton has portrayed the pile of cotton in the same triangular shape as the overseer's bent legs, his feet buried in cotton, stuck to the land. This is symbolic of the ways in which Benton described this boss as, quote, "grooved to his ways, which, though he deplored them, he couldn't escape. I can imagine the scorn with which some of the cocksure social radicals of the big cities would regard him, but he was a good man, and one who I am sure would not leave his Negroes in the event of any catastrophe to shift for themselves. I think he would see them through. With what will probably be a continuous and yearly accelerated drop of cotton values in the world market, and with the possible coming also of the new cotton picking machine into general use, his Negroes are going to need care." End quote. Although Benton mentioned the possible coming of the new cotton picking machine, the emphasis would have been on possible. The triumphant tone of a 1910 article entitled "A Cotton Harvester at Last" articulated a dream to invent, quote, "the mechanical cotton picker, the impossible machine that will discriminate between ripe and unripe cotton bolls, finger over the delicate plant, get the lint and leave the rest unharmed. This contrivance of almost human intelligence has at last been made." The author, Arthur Page, proclaimed the virtues, quote, "of a machine that will emancipate cotton from low-grade labor, disband the black army of cotton pickers that have kept King Cotton from being an enlightened ruler, a South without the yearly demoralization of cotton-picking time, when men, women, and children from the mills, kitchens, schools, and everywhere desert their vocations for the cotton patch. That would be a new South indeed," end quote. But the impossible machine remained just that, despite continuous efforts since the earliest trials in the 1850s to develop the technology. Not until 1924, when International Harvester purchased patents issued in 1912, did transformational advances begin to take place. Benton may have been aware of reports of the 7 different machine types being tested in the mid-20s by the agricultural giant. Experimentation went on through the 1930s. One chief development engineer for International Harvester reflected in 1951 on these early efforts. Quote, "Considerable opposition to mechanical picking was encountered in the field. Many cotton farmers were very skeptical and sure that the cotton crop could not be mechanized. At the end of every harvest season, we returned with a little more experience and a little more ridicule, for the average cotton grower believed firmly in the eternal supremacy of the Negro cotton picker." Another challenge to mechanization was that the majority of cotton crops grew on what historian Gilbert Feet called small, irregularly shaped rolling farms of less than 30 acres. Over half of these produced fewer than 4 bales each. It took approximately an acre of picked cotton to fill a traditional wagon, which held about 1,500 pounds of raw cotton. When full, the wagon would be taken to the gin to produce the 500-pound bale of cotton. The prevalence of small-scale farming stressed the land, causing the soil erosion and price collapses discussed earlier. On top of this, the moisture-loving boll weevil insect, a pest introduced into Texas in 1892 and notoriously difficult to control, had spread eastward, aggressively infesting crops across Georgia and South Carolina by 1922. I'm showing you here Jacob Lawrence's painting of the boll weevil from 1940. In the early 1970s, Ned Cobb an Alabama sharecropper then in his 80s, recalled and interpreted the devastating impact the pest could have. Quote, "All God's dangers ain't a white man. When the boll weevil starts in your cotton and go to depositing his eggs in them squares, that's when he'll kill you." The stagnating cotton economy commenced an overall decline in cotton growing acreage and opportunities, hardships that some, like Cobb, survived and others couldn't or wouldn't withstand. These circumstances swelled an ongoing exodus of African Americans out of the South, incrementally increasing a growing shortage of black workers and intensifying the need for mechanized cotton harvesting. And I'm going to show just a few of panels from the Great Migration. Let's see, sorry, I lost my picture. The movement of African Americans from the South to the North, now known as the Great Migration, began during World War I when more labor was needed for new jobs supporting the war effort. But the conditions in the rural South that Benton witnessed in his travel greatly accelerated the population shifts. In 1940, Jacob Lawrence produced his landmark series of 60 panels interpreting these changes, and called The Migration of the Negro. Lawrence synthesized word and image to create a powerful modernist epic depicting a people's history of African American migrants with declarative captions, a few of which I quote. This is panel 3. In every town, Negroes were leaving by the hundreds to go north and enter into northern industry. Another great ravager of the crops was the boll weevil. Due to the South losing much of its labor, the crops were left to dry and spoil. Another cause was lynching. It was found that where there had been a lynching, the people who were reluctant to leave at first left immediately after this. The migration was spurred on by the treatment of the tenant farmers by the planter. Child labor and a lack of education was one of the other reasons for people wishing to leave their homes. Lawrence's series exemplified many of the scenes and struggles Benton saw or knew about during the years the substantial migrations took place. In 1929, the year Vidor's movie Hallelujah premiered, the Delphic Studios Gallery in New York mounted The South, an exhibition featuring drawings Benton made in South Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Critic and curator Lloyd Goodrich asserted, quote, "Mr. Benton comes naturally by his native flavor. A grandnephew and namesake of the famous senator from Missouri, he knows the South, its country, and its people. A recent wandering voyage through most of the southern states has resulted in the drawings and watercolors, more than 100 of them now on view," end quote. Of these 100 drawings, the section labeled King Cotton constituted 60 works on paper, more than any other sections of the South included in the show. The drawings reveal Benton's interest in authenticity and interpreting the South from first-hand experiences, so that he might express King Cotton as an industry, as a melding of black and white experiences, as an expression of American vernacular, and as a means to show the interconnectedness of history, culture, and race. Benton's well-received works on paper depicting specific regions and inhabitants set the stage for his first successful mural commission, America Today, in which the South would figure prominently. The New School for Social Research in Manhattan commissioned Benton to create murals for its new building, which he completed in 1930. America Today was Benton's first attempt to put his drawings of regional types and traditions to direct use and to use a regional organizational structure. Although there are only 2 major black figures depicted in City Building on your left and Deep South on your right, they are at both ends of the mural panels and symbolically anchor the entire mural cycle and, by extension, the American economy. They are dressed identically with their arms raised in a gesture that frames each head. For Benton, these rural and urban black workers represented the foundations of capitalist America. In City Building, Benton likely based the dramatic portions and deep skin tone of the construction worker on his observations during Southern travels of what he called, quote, the Negroes of the Sea Islands, the Gullahs. He described them as, quote, very black. They are long-headed as a rule. Their features are very clean-cut, like beautiful ebony carvings, end quote. In Deep South, the strong white highlights on the black face can be seen as a metaphor for how white and black relations structured life in the Deep South, as well as simply reflections of the white cotton pile below. The emptied bag could have alluded to cotton picking as a life one could leave behind, as the Great Migration was proving. This man disgorges a bag of cotton, conceivably for the last time. Alvin Johnson of the New School interpreted this figure in an early 1930s essay as, quote, the triumphant Negro. This representation contrasts with the images of the black men in Benton's large-scale watercolor cotton pickers, painted in 1931 in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum. The stereotypical features of a loafing black worker and a strong man carrying the cotton sack reveal the range of an expression and controversy Benton willingly engaged in his pursuit and exploration of what he deemed authentic American form. Benton's gallery exhibitions in 1924, 26, and 27 provoked a compulsive use of these terms to describe his art: satirical, humorous, grotesque, character, type, and most frequently, caricature. As early as 1924, Goodrich had written that, quote, with Benton there is more deliberate caricature and more conscious attempt at grotesque form. He has struck a rich vein, and it is hoped that he will continue to work with it. The 1931 Cotton Pickers watercolor is evidence that he did. Another critic for the New York Times identified the artist's interest in caricaturing what Goodrich deemed the American type, and the cotton picker was undeniably one such type. That review noted, quote, that Mr. Benton objects to having his American portraits called caricatures, a picture marked by ridicule or exaggeration. That definition seems to fit the portraits admirably. The artist no doubt wishes to save for posterity certain fast disappearing American types. One way of doing so is to exaggerate peculiarities. That in itself is ridicule. Critics also found Benton's next murals offensive, the 1932 Arts of Life in America series painted for the Whitney Museum of American Art. In the Arts of the South panel, cotton picking does not figure, but music does. Benton privileged the section entitled Negro Singing. The black man leading the song is the largest figure at the center, and his heft and position convey the importance of Negro song or spirituals to American culture, as well as its independence. It is a tradition that can turn its back on white singing, as Benton depicted. Yet the dual tree trunks symbolically root the white and black expressions of faith and music literally in the same ground, encircled by the same foliage. Consider also that what at first glance appears to be a troubling parallel at the lower edge of the mural, the black mother and child at lower left, next to the trash pile at lower right, may not be. These two sections are the edges of a broken circle, divided by the patch of dark green matter at the center. The two halves move in opposite directions. Follow the mother and child clockwise towards the blacks gathered in song. On the other side, follow the trash pile counterclockwise around to what Benton called holy rollers, or the get next to God worshipers and singers. Benton very well may have sought to link the presumed racism and hysterical righteousness of evangelical Southern whites to white trash, a phrase invented in the 19th century, while elevating what he saw as the fortitude of the often besieged black family and experience in the South. Benton audaciously endeavored to mix real observations of life and experiences of ordinary Americans with caricature and stereotype. He had spent significant time in the South and felt at liberty to admit in his essay about these murals that, quote, practically every form is bound up with implications which take away from purely plastic values. This is deliberate. He blurred boundaries between his interest in American types and typing in general. His embrace of caricature and stereotype as viable expressions of American identity for American art, often in public murals no less, frequently subverted the ability of many to appreciate his methods. Few gleaned that in Arts of the South he may have been ridiculing whites. Toni Morrison wrote in Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the American Literary Imagination that, quote, the economy of stereotype allows the writer a quick and easy image without the responsibility of specificity, accuracy, or even narratively useful description. Benton used scenes of cotton picking both to deploy and to overcome the economy of stereotype. He did want to save for posterity fast disappearing American types, in the Times critics' words, an impulse inherently tinged with the stereotypical, but he also wanted to explore race and identity in America. Like many of his contemporaries, he viewed cotton pickers as an essential way to do this. Consider Aaron Douglas's important mural series from 1934, Aspects of Negro Life, commissioned by the Public Works of Art Project. Douglas created the murals for the New York Public Library's 135th Street branch, now the Schomburg Center for Black Art and Culture. Aspects of Negro Life comprises 4 monumental panels envisioning the physical and spiritual journeys of African Americans from their homes in Africa to modern life in Jazz Age American cities. This panel is entitled From Slavery Through Reconstruction. Using angular silhouetted figures painted in light and dark colors, Douglas synthesized the sagas of slavery, racial terror, and freedom in stylistically modernist ways, in a manner utterly different from Benton's exaggerated and three-dimensional figural style. Douglas layered transparent and opaque forms and concentric circles of radiating light to flatten space and depth across the 5-foot-high and 11-foot-long mural. He united the composition with a frieze of naturalistic cotton bolls that extends almost the length of the mural's foreground. It crescendos into tall cotton, then decrescendos to come to a stop, just beyond the slave who broke his chains. Douglas's representation of the cotton plant as a unifying visual, thematic, and narrative element in a public mural panel is a prime example of the importance of the cotton picking theme to major American artists by the 1930s. But even an emerging artist like Jackson Pollock, Benton's most famous student, painted the subject in 1935. At the moment, massive federal efforts were underway to combat pervasive poor land management and farming practices. Benton made his first lithograph, Plowing It Under, seen here. A new organization founded in 1934, the Associated American Artists, commissioned prints by American artists as part of a new effort to support them during the Depression and to make art more widely and commercially available. Plowing under crops was then a hot topic and a savvy choice for the first print chosen to launch the sales of Associated American Artists prints at 50 department stores nationwide. Benton's was based on his 1929 painting, Plowing. Benton retitled the print Plowing It Under because his South Carolina pastoral now could represent a new federal program in action. As part of President Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, Congress enacted legislation to limit the supply of agricultural production and therefore drive up prices. Farmers had to plow under more than 10 million acres of cotton already planted. The timing of Benton's publicity could not have been better for the Associated American Artists. On Christmas Eve in 1934, just 2 months after the organization's launch, Benton appeared on the cover of Time magazine, a first for Time and an artist. Plowing It Under sold out. Benton ultimately made 50 prints for the Associated American Artists. 12,000 sold, and they were the organization's best sellers. 2 portrayed cotton scenes, Hoeing Cotton on your left, based on a late 1930s drawing, and Back from the Fields, based on a 1945 painting. During the 1930s, Benton was busy producing lithographs, completing 2 massive mural projects for the states of Indiana and Missouri in 1933 and 1936, respectively, permanent relocation in 1935 with his family from New York to Kansas City, an influential 1937 trip to Hollywood, the preparation of his autobiography manuscript, and major easel paintings. Cotton picking did not appear in Benton's art during these years. So many of the kinds of scenes Benton had already drawn and painted in the late 1920s became the focus of the highly publicized photography program of the Farm Security Administration. And for comparison, I show you a photograph by Dorothea Lange entitled, "The Cotton Sharecropper's Unit is One Mule, and the Land He Can Cultivate with a One-Horse Plow," from Georgia in 1937. This is Russell Lee's Emptying Bag of Cotton Onto Truck, Lehigh, Arkansas, circa 1935. And here's Ben Shaw's Cotton Pickers from Pulaski County, Arkansas in 1935. Frequently photographed as well was the task of weighing cotton, seen in the movie Hallelujah, and here in photos by Arthur Rothstein on your left and Ben Shaw on your right. Their images relate closely to Benton's only easel painting about cotton picking during this decade, Weighing Cotton, painted in 1939. It was Benton's written descriptions that were more direct than many official government images. Benton actually addressed the effects of racism on American society, bluntly stating, quote, "The racial system in the South is explosive. The economic situation of the South is not permanently tenable. King Cotton is going the way of the other kings. Some 3 million of his dependent subjects looking around for their bread and butter are going to put a heavy strain on resources that are already strained. The Southerner is irascible. He runs easily to violence. Let him see his difficulty as one of class conflict with a racial base, and he will rise to the occasion in a way that is far from being socially desirable. And Benton's talking about white Southerners here. Benton attributed the disintegration of King Cotton generally to the treatment of blacks in the South and the behavior of whites, a frank assessment of the region totally sublimated in Pere Lorenz's 1937 documentary, The River, distributed widely by Paramount, and I showed a clip earlier. It was the impact on white tenant farmers that served as the emotional underpinnings of this propagandistic film. These stills from the movie of white cotton pickers provide the pivot point in the film to turn to a celebratory overview of the federal government's concerted effort to combat the national shame of white poverty, facing, in Lorenz's words, quote, a generation whose people knew Fremont and Custer, but a generation facing a life of dirt and poverty, disease and drudgery, end quote. In drastic contrast, Lorenz's poetry and imagery pictured an African-American family forced off their land and heading west to where no one knew.
We mined the soil for cotton until it would yield no more, and then moved west. We fought a war, but there was a double tragedy. The tragedy of land twice impoverished.
It is wrenching to consider how the situations of white tenant farmers and sharecroppers were so privileged over black cotton pickers doing the same work. The same unequal presentation emerged in the photographs publicized by the FSA. Today we know Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, the displaced Oklahoma farmer's wife, over Marion Post Wolcott's mother and child pausing for water in the cotton fields. Another famous project was James Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, published in 1941 and illustrated with Walker Evans's now iconic portraits of the Burroughs family sharecroppers created to accompany the text. This book also communicated that America saw the plight of its poor white farmers as the most serious travesty of the nation. Writing in 1937, Benton acknowledged the changes a decade had wrought on the Cotton Belt. Quote, "It is 8 or 10 years ago that I stood in this Georgia cotton field and talked about the Negroes. It is possible, of course, that my overseer, no more an overseer, is without power to help anyone. Today, the plight of the Southern sharecroppers and the tenant farmers is very much in the air. So much has been written about them of a documented and exacting nature that what I will have to say will seem pretty old stuff. In my rambling journeys about the South, I have seen much of the Southern feudal system and the kind of humanity for which it is responsible. I agree with the more scientific reviewers of our social order that it is one of the major sores of our civilization." Yet Benton's interest in depicting cotton picking gained new momentum in the early 1940s. He had occasion to travel to Georgia in 1941 on commission from the American Tobacco Company to paint a picture for the corporation's promotional purposes. He recorded the events in his 1968 technical autobiography, An American in Art. Now, in South Georgia, the tobacco is largely handled by Negroes, and my drawings and studies were, of course, devoted to them. I made a whole book of sketches, enough for 20 pictures, and felt sure that among these a suitable motif would be found. When on returning to New York, I showed my book to his advertising promoters, I ran into a most horrified protestation. After this, I went to North Carolina where the hillbillies handled tobacco and came back with what appeared to be an acceptable picture. This was the 1941 painting, Tobacco Sorters, now at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Marketers were unable to imagine publishing an image of a black field worker like this 1938 snapshot by an unknown photographer, even though it was a majority experience in the tobacco and cotton industries. The reluctance to picture African Americans gets to the core of what Gunnar Myrdal reported in his highly influential 1944 book, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. Quote, "When we say that there is a Negro problem in America, what we mean is that the Americans are worried about it. It is on their minds and on their consciences." The section of his book, Explaining the Problem Away, demonstrated how hard Americans tried to keep racial issues, quote, below the level of consciousness, to keep everything quiet on the racial front, end quote. In the 1940s, Benton diverged from this general attitude by portraying singular black figures in his art. This slide shows Aaron, painted in 1941 on the upper left, Negro Soldier, painted in 1942 on the upper right, Water Boy from 1946, lower left, and Jazz Musician from 1949. The trip to paint Georgia tobacco workers exposed Benton to cotton picking scenes again and renewed his interest in the subject, such as the cotton picker painted in 1943 to 44. Benton made several studies and paintings at the time that now related to earlier FSA imagery. These are cotton picker paintings Benton made around 1944, compared with Russell Lee's activity around a cotton wagon in the upper right and Marion Post Walcott's wagon loading from around 1938. Benton's 1945 painting Back from the Field and Cotton Bin resonate with a 1940 photograph by Walcott of, quote, an old tenant house with a mud chimney and cotton growing up to its door. This is Benton's painting Plantation Road, painted in 1944 in the Carnegie Museum. In 1944, the same year Benton painted this picture, International Harvester introduced the first successful mechanical cotton picker on the Hobson Farm in Clarksdale, Mississippi. It was the first cotton crop to be entirely planted, harvested, and baled successfully by machine. The days of the human cotton picker were numbered, even though it would be 2 to 3 more decades until mechanical harvesting completely eliminated hand-picking cotton. The historic achievement of successful mechanized cotton harvesting likely signaled to Benton the slowly fading relevance of the cotton picker as a subject, as it had come and gone for FSA photographers, and as the numbers of workers themselves were dwindling. In 1947, Oscar Johnston, the manager of the Mississippi cotton plantation that was the largest in the United States, declared, quote, mechanization is not the cause, but the result of economic change in the area. Most, if not all, of the migration of farmers and farm workers which has taken place during the past few years has resulted from factors other than mechanization itself. Benton's late cotton-picking paintings may appear as romantic, nostalgic, and stereotypical images about this disappearing way of life, but they are filled with activity capturing the energetic work that went on after the cotton was picked, from gathering to storing to loading. These paintings kept cotton-picking scenes active in his audience's minds, as if to continually remind them that the cotton pickers should not be overlooked, that they were still important. They do contrast dramatically, however, with nearly contemporaneous works by Jacob Lawrence and John Biggers. I show you Lawrence's Red Earth, Georgia, and Biggers' Cotton Pickers, both from 1947. The violently rendered earth in Lawrence's picture and the monumental pathos expressed through Biggers' sculptural figure grouping represent the explosive and untenable nature of the situation in the South that Benton wrote about but never painted so explicitly. The blood-red ground in Lawrence's picture contrasts markedly with the bright, gay pink color Benton saw in 1928 on those same Georgia fields. Lawrence's and Biggers' works confronted in completely different ways from Benton the persistently egregious conditions for black cotton pickers in the Jim Crow South. As one historian noted in 1950, quote, although mechanical cotton production is in advanced stages in some sections, most of the old cotton belt scarcely has been touched by modern machines. Cotton Pickers, painted in 1945, was Benton's final meditation on king cotton and his most profound expression of the subject. A culmination of his interpretations of the rural South begun in 1927, it is steeped in the grandest art historical traditions. The painting has a harmoniously arranged and classically ordered composition combining still life, figure, and landscape painting. Benton selectively used a bright red to draw the eye to key parts of the scene, a classic compositional and narrative technique employed by painters throughout art history as well as Hollywood. The color is a noticeably Technicolor red. It appears in the field of vision with the Technicolor pale blue of the sky, a typical palette used throughout this period in Hollywood movies. Benton chose a woman as the protagonist of this scene and dressed her in a long red skirt with a clean white shirt and shoes. She centers the composition in this familial group of cotton pickers. She stands tall at the intersection of a diagonal stretching from the top right to lower left corner and another diagonal from the top left to lower right corner. Through these diagonals, she connects on one side the wagon piled high with cotton being pulled by a mule and a large still life of a thriving cotton plant. On the other side, she is the link between the traditional cabin home and the unclothed baby lying on the same Technicolor red blanket next to, not in, as stereotypical postcards often showed, a full basket of fluffy cotton. These three foreground areas of red and the stalk of the cotton plant, the woman's skirt, and the baby's blanket create a triangular grouping linking multi-generational experiences and legacies of cotton picking. The water giver's head is elevated above the gently undulating landscape and a frieze of fellow workers whose rhythmic line and movements echo the contours of the field. She possesses an obvious stoicism despite the weariness evident in her lanky body. Her eyes are closed or directed downward, and she holds steady the cup of water for the thirsty cotton picker at the edge of the field on his knees. His thirst, her gesture, the hats on all heads shading faces, and the lean-to protecting the naked baby from the sun all communicate the intense heat of the cotton belt climate and the conditions workers endure to pick cotton. In this painting, Benton surpassed the quotidian character of most of his cotton picker scenes. The sophisticated, formal, even cinematic underpinnings of his composition and the deliberate emphasis on the palpable humanity of the physical experiences, actions, and labor of the figures represent what Lewis Mumford had called a maturer form of Americana. On this canvas, the figures function as symbolic cotton pickers honored for historic sacrifices and contributions to the nation. In his last cotton-picking painting, Benton artistically elevated a humble scene of cotton pickers to the traditionally venerated realm of history painting, a lifelong impulse revealed in the artist's finest work. Thank you.